Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Tales of Home, we retell those moments, honest, everyday, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. The cartons weren't heavy, just loud flaps, rasping, tape crackling, the kind of noise a quiet street notices. I carried two at a time up the steps of the house on Linden Avenue, the porch where chalk suns once faded into the grain each time it rained. Inside the top box, a wool cap that still held the shape of Daniel's head. On the bottom, a ledger in his blocky handwriting. Between them, photographs that always made the air feel cooler when I looked. I hadn't reached the bell before the door opened. Sloane stood there in her immaculate way, a cardigan that never wrinkled and a voice trained to cut without raising itself. "Eliza, you can't come in unless you apologize." She didn't decorate the sentence with why. She didn't need to. We both carried the same scene like a bruise, her silk dress at the neighborhood barbecue, the snag she'd presented to a semicircle of neighbors, and my name placed in its shadow. Behind the screen, my son hovered, hands folded, gaze dropped to the scuffed threshold like he was studying weather maps. Noah had Daniel's shoulders and my habit of clearing a throat when words crowded. Today there was no clearing. I waited for him to say it was a misunderstanding, to gesture aside to make space for the boxes I had brought from my attic because he'd asked for them. He shifted his weight. He said nothing. "Here are the things you wanted," I offered, because saying something seemed kinder than letting the air do all the work. I angled a carton toward the gap. Sloane's arms crossed. The screen door did not move. The house breathed behind them, warm bread, a citrus cleaner, the faint bass line of a radio in some back room. And I stood outside inhaling other people's life, like steam rising from a pot I no longer owned. It would have been easy to argue. I knew the bench at the barbecue had been freshly sanded. I knew I'd brushed it before dinner, not her sleeve. I'd even called the boutique the next day, more from curiosity than guilt, and the clerk remembered Sloane bringing the dress in that morning with a frayed seam that was already going. I knew all of this. But knowledge rarely overrules choreography. Sloane had repeated her story in a voice that welcomed agreement, and agreement had come the way a tide arrives, small at first, then general. I bent, nudged the nearest box with the toe of my shoe, and then when the little performance of practicality felt too pitiful to continue, I straightened and gave Noah the smallest nod I had. He kept his eyes down. "I'll text you," he said finally. The promise of people who intend to let time answer for them. I carried the cartons back along the porch, where the chalk suns used to be, and down the steps whose paint remembered our old dog's nails. The camellia hedge on the side yard was in an impossible red blooms, cupped like small hands. Daniel had planted them the year Noah learned to ride without training wheels. I remembered him kneeling in the dirt, saying the word loam with reverence. The hedge is why I closed the trunk gently so the lid wouldn't shiver the petals. In the driver's seat, I let my palms rest on the wheel and stared through the windshield at the reflection of the house roof lines. I knew by fingertip a porch post I'd once sanded smooth, a storm window that sticks each October. 42 years of living makes a place feel less like a structure than a sentence you've written together. I turned the key. The engine clicked once and caught. I pulled away the cartons, humming in the trunk like attentive bees. At the stop sign, I looked back. Noah stood in the frame for a second, a slender gray shape, and then Sloane touched his forearm and the door closed. I took a left onto Maple, a right onto Fairchild, and the town folded open the way it does when you know the back streets, the tailor who still chalks hems the old way, the thrift shop where an embroidered heron has hung for 3 owners. The weather held in that blank space between late summer and the first breath of cold. My hand steadied. I drove to my own smaller house, the one with the lemon tree that will never quite thrive, and the kitchen window that finds a single loud stripe of light at exactly 4:10 in the afternoon. Setting the cartons on my table, I listened to the familiar complaint of the chair as I pulled it out, a sound that used to annoy me and now felt like a greeting. When the hour arrived, the stripe cut across the table like a ruler, and the dust inside it lifted in slow weather. I lifted a lid. The ledger sat on top, Daniel's block printing as tender as any cursive Titan upstairs valve. Replace porch rail. Call Nora about piano. The lines carried the calm rhythm of a person who believed problems were things that could be resolved with a trip to the hardware store and a better screwdriver. Beneath that photograph's Noah with a birthday crown made from construction paper. My daughter June asleep on Daniel's chest, her mouth open like a small, astonished bird. Under the photographs, receipts, property tax, roof repair, a check stub for a furnace we replaced in the year of 3 storms. Paper that could add up to something when people preferred anecdotes. The barbecue, yes. The way Sloane had turned to the crowd halfway through the evening, fingertips poised at a snag near the hip, the performance of disappointment polished to an art. It's nothing she'd said with that smile that taught people to lean closer. Eliza just caught it on the bench. The word just is a brilliant servant. It carries the story over the line. I'd tried to laugh it off to say the cedar was raw and my skirt had caught there too. Sloane had patted my forearm as though I'd confessed to borrowing earrings. By dessert, the snag was a parable and I had become its author. I closed the ledger and set it beside the stack of envelopes. The house was quiet around me in the way old rooms can be when they hold their breath, not empty but paused. I made tea. I did not hurry it. Steam shredded itself against the cabinet's underside. The spoon touched the inside of the cup with a single chime. Outside, a child on a scooter counted aloud as she coasted past my window, 9, 10, 11, and her voice wobbled on the turns. On the sill, a chip in the paint, shaped like a comma, snagged the light. I ran my thumb across it and felt the grain of the old wood rise. Some marks you sand out and some you keep because they are not damaged so much as record. I put the photographs back in order. I slid the ledger beneath them. The sunstripe marched off the table and down the wall, and the kitchen became its usual forgiving self. Words steadied in my mouth, not a speech, not a plea, simply the sound a lock makes when you turn it the correct way and feel the tumblers arrange. I stacked the cartons neatly in the corner, wrote a date on each lid, and let the house hold still. I did not argue with shadows. I did not inventory lost furniture. I stood in my kitchen, palms flat on the cool table, and named the rooms aloud: kitchen, hall, bedroom, bath, like a person counting their ribs. When I finished, the air seemed less borrowed. The water in the kettle had quieted. I emptied my cup, rinsed it, and set it upside down to dry. The day had its shape again. I allowed it to stand. The house kept its quiet after the kettle cooled, a quiet that didn't erase sound so much as hold it in the grain. I stacked the cartons in the corner, then pulled the top one back to the table and opened it again with a steadier hand. Paper has a smell when it has been kept for decades, linen dust, a sweetness from old glue. I let it rise and pass me like a remembered voice. Beneath the photographs lay a folder I didn't recognize by sight, but knew by the way my fingers paused. A tab labeled in Daniel's print title, occupancy. The word looked plain until I drew out the contents and the light fell across the first page. County seal. Signatures in 2 different shades of blue. A paragraph Daniel had underlined lightly, the way he did with books he valued. Grant of exclusive right to reside and to manage ordinary affairs of the premises for the natural life of Eliza Hart. The language sounded like a judge trying not to be poetic and failing. I read it twice, then folded the page open to the margin notes in Daniel's block hand. This keeps you home, Liz. Under it, a second document with later dates. My name repeated through it like a refrain: taxpayer, payer, owner of record for listed repairs. Roof work, a furnace replacement, 3 years of guttering after the sap-heavy spring that kept dropping its mess on the back steps. A clerk had stamped each page paid in a purple that had faded to bruise. I laid them out in rose paper lanterns making their own street down the oak tabletop. A memory of the barbecue nudged in. I let it pass through and out. Sloane's invention had found a mouth in others because I had not bothered to answer it in the language it respected. Stories prefer witnesses. Paper prefers totals. I took a pencil from the drawer, wrote dates on sticky notes, and attached them to the corners. The table became a grid that showed not only ownership, but attendance year after year. If anyone asked the room who had carried it, the answer would sit in plain view. My phone lay face down near the stove. I flipped it and opened the contacts. The bank's main line listed a number for Client Services local branch, but I chose the direct extension of the person who had helped me reorder a debit card last winter, a man whose voice I remembered as careful and unhurried. First Harbor Bank, this is Levi Park. Mr. Park. It's Eliza Hart on Pine Street, I said. I have a question about the property records tied to my account. I'm looking at a deed and an attached agreement that refers to exclusive right to reside and manage. I'd like to make sure I read them correctly. He didn't rush into bafflement or ask me to upload a file to a portal I'd forget how to find. He asked 3 precise questions: date, section header, names of signers. I answered, and I could hear him turning to his screen, typing the little intake of breath people make when a line confirmed something they suspected. Yes, Ms. Hart, he said at length. I'm looking at the recorded instruments. You are a co-owner and you hold a life right. More than occupancy, it confers day-to-day control. Add to that the payment trail you've described. You're standing on solid boards. I let the words settle like dust after someone closes a book. If I needed legal interpretation beyond the bank's comfort, I said, is there someone local you trust to explain the teeth of this language? There is, he said, and read me a name and address on Grant Street. Marta Bell. She handles transfers and the family messes that often come wrapped around them. I wrote the name, thank you. Levi hesitated a second, not the way of someone trying to sell another product, but the way of someone placing care in the mailbox. You sound like you've been carrying a lot of the invisible work for a long time, he said. Documents remember what people forget. Sometimes they do, I said, and we said goodbye. Outside light shifted slightly, a barely perceptible turn that made the lemon leaves flash dull silver. I put the deed and the payment pages into a fresh envelope, added Daniel's ledger to the stack, and slid a rubber band around the bundle. Another folder on the bottom of the carton held tax receipts from the county, stretching back more years than I wanted to count. I took the topmost 10 to make a clean sample and pressed them under a heavy cookbook so they'd lie flat. At 3:15, I took my coat from its peg and walked the 4 blocks to Grant Street. The office I entered used to be a shoe shop. I recognized the arched glass at the transom and the faint smell of leather that never entirely leaves a place once it has lived there long enough. A bell gave a modest ring when the door closed. The receptionist looked up with an expression that didn't assume trouble or announce it. "You have an appointment?" "No," I said, "but I was told Ms. Bell sometimes reads a page between meetings." She considered, then nodded toward 2 chairs near the window. "Let me ask." The minutes in the chair were not unkind. A pot of ivy climbed along the sill. The street outside sent a sweep of pedestrians past like a measured river. When Marta Bell came out, she was shorter than I expected, with gray hair pulled back and glasses perched just low enough to signal she could see better than you thought. "You brought papers," she said dryly. "Good. I can read." In her office, sunlight struck a framed photograph of a woman on a beach, a child running just outside the frame. The streak of light cut across them like a promise. I placed the envelope on the desk and slid the first page free. Marta read with a patience that didn't advertise itself. Her fingertip landed on the underlined paragraph. She nodded once, then turned to the later pages. "You have what the law calls a life estate with administrative authority. It's not mere residency, it's keys plus discretion." She tapped the stamped receipts. "And you have a spine of proof for maintenance and taxes. If anyone claims you've been a passive beneficiary, these speak otherwise." The word spine pleased me more than it should. I sat back. "If a co-owner objects to decisions I make regarding the property's management," I asked, "does their objection halt me?" "Not in the ordinary," she said. "They may dispute price or process in a sale. They may attempt to complicate by posture. But this instrument vests day-to-day control with you. If you chose to retain, you manage. If you chose to divest, you authorize." She set the page down and met my eyes. "Paper is colder than memory, but it has advantages." I nodded, "Thank you." We spoke a while longer about dates, about the county's preferred forms, about how to keep copies in more than one place without tempting misplacement. When I left, I had 3 new sheets in my envelope, a summary letter on firm letterhead that restated the language in plain English, a checklist for record keeping, and a card with Marta's number should I need her to confirm anything to a third party. Grant Street is a curve. I let it carry me toward the square where the florist had already leaned buckets of late dahlias against the stoop. Their colors looked like fruit someone had decided to eat with their eyes. I stopped, chose a thin bundle the color of rust and honey, and walked home with them balanced against my palm. A child on the corner was practicing a trumpet scale, every note slightly bent, every breath a little courage. Back in my kitchen, the sunstripe had crept to the floor. I put water on again and opened another carton. This one held less memory and more obligation appliance manuals with corners turned down, warranties long expired but kept out of habit, photographs of paint cans with their labels visible so I could match them later. I sorted what mattered into one pile and what didn't into a second. A third pile I made for the kind of object that isn't useful but insists on staying because it holds a story. Daniel's bent screwdriver that he called the Persuader, a brass knob, with a nick that matched the scar on my thumb. The phone rang once and stopped a misdial or a change of mind. I let it go. The kettle lifted its lid a fraction and began to whisper. I took the bundle from Grant Street from the envelope and placed it on the tabletop, page face up. The paragraph about exclusive right to reside and manage looked less like a rule than a description of the life I had already lived. When the tea steeped, I carried the cup to the sink and stood there the way people stand at windows when they think instead of count. The camellias on Linden Avenue would be lit on their western edges now. Sloane would fold a cardigan and smooth it flat, because that is what she does with everything she chooses to keep. Noah would move through his kitchen with a careful economy, closing drawers, fully checking knobs once. These are habits I know without malice. A life together breeds knowledge that doesn't die when other things do. On the table, the rows of paper looked less like ammunition and more like a ledger you keep because you once promised yourself you would. I took out a blank note card and wrote 3 lines in the hand I use when I want to hear myself think. Deed life right, administrative control confirmed. Tax 10 years assembled. Earlier years available in file box B. Repairs ledger, cross-references receipts summarized. I dated the card and tucked it into the front of the folder. A small order where chaos had tried to live. The lemon leaves outside rubbed together once in a breath of air and went still again. I washed my cup, dried it, and set it in the rack. The room held its shape around me table window chair that complained, and I fit into it with the ease of someone who has decided to sit up straight. I slid the envelope into my bag, placed the cartons neatly against the wall, and wiped the table with a clean cloth until the grain shone. Then I opened the drawer where I keep his stamps, took out a narrow address book with a blue spine, and laid it next to the neat stack of papers ready for names I could trust. By late afternoon, the light thinned to a pale, serviceable gold, the sort of light that makes a room honest. I had left the narrow blue address book beside the neat stack of papers, as if names might rise out of the grain by themselves. They didn't. I ran a finger down the first page, paused at Ruth P., a neighbor who has the rare gift of giving a suggestion once and then keeping her hands off it. "Ruth," I said when her voicemail took the call. "It's Eliza. I'm looking for someone discreet who understands older houses and the way families bend around them. If there's a broker you trust, will you send a name?" I set the phone down and returned to the table where the envelope from Grant Street lay, like a small, satisfied animal. I read Marta's letter again, the paragraph that laid out without music or apology the rights I'd been living as if permission were something I needed to earn. The kettle's lid jumped once and rattled to a rest. I poured water over a tea bag and let it stain the cup. Halfway through the first sip, the phone buzzed against the wood. A text from Ruth as spare as her garden rose, Harper Lynn. Straightforward, private showings when needed. A number followed, then a second line. "Tell her I sent you if that helps." I called while the steam climbed. The voice that answered carried clipped warmth like someone who could make 4 lists and keep them all straight. "Harper Lynn. This is Eliza Hart on Pine Street," I said. "A friend recommended you. I'm considering changes with a property on Linden Avenue. I'd prefer quiet over spectacle." "Then we'll choose this door that stays closed," she said without ceremony. 2 questions. What do you want, visibility or speed? And do you have paperwork in good order? Discretion over both, I said. And yes. Deed, tax receipts, maintenance trail. A lawyer has summarized the key language. Good, Harper said. I like a table with corners. I'll bring an inspector I trust for a pre-list walkthrough. No postcards, no balloons. If we move forward, I'll curate 3 buyers at most. You'll see intent before shoes cross the threshold. A short pause. Tomorrow morning, the speed of it felt like competence rather than urgency. Yes, I said. We arranged a time. She texted a courtesy confirmation within a minute. The message included the inspector's name, Gabe Renteria, and a note about his habit of listening to walls by tapping lightly as if they might answer. Before the water cooled, another message lit the screen. Noah, Mom, don't make this bigger than it is. The sentence had the politeness of a person lowering blinds. I laid the phone face down, then righted it without haste. 10 minutes later, a new notification from Sloane Harper. We will accept your apology tomorrow. The certainty in the plural gave the words a plank to walk on. I did not answer. I slid Marta's letter beneath the deed and made the stack square with a palm. The oven's idea of time is better than mine. I set flour and butter out on the counter and worked them into a dough that remembered how to come together. The motion steadied me in a way conversation rarely does. I sugared fruit and folded it into the pie, like an argument that doesn't need to raise its voice. While the crust browned, I dragged 2 empty boxes from the hall closet and wrote on their lids in a thick black marker. On one, keep mine. On the other, leave no longer mine. The decisions came easier than I expected. Daniel's wristwatch went into the first, its tick unbothered by new address books or old claims. A novelty apron with Sloane's careful monogram slid into the second without friction. In the drawer of the sideboard, I found a brass key whose tooth had a nick. I held it up to the kitchen light until the notch made sense. It had once belonged to the crawlspace hatch where Daniel hid a tin of cash in the year the bank's computers failed. The memory arrived whole. I placed the key in the keep box and closed the lid, not to shut anything out, just to make a small order of breath and wood. At 8 the next morning, Harper arrived in a slate coat and shoes that could stand on a ladder without wobbling. She introduced Gabe with the simplicity of people who trust competence to speak for itself. He was a broad-shouldered man whose hands belonged to both a pencil and a hammer. I'll move quietly, he said. If I tap, I'm not being rude. I'm listening. We did not go first to Linden Avenue. Harper wanted to walk my Pine Street rooms to understand the way I kept paper. I'm mapping your habits, she said, not unkindly. How you keep things tells me how to keep you from losing them. She took in the envelope stack with a quick, appreciative look. Marta's letter is clear. Good. We'll keep a copy in my file and one in yours. Now, Linden. The camellias on the side yard of the Linden house were open and particular, each blossom cupped like a confident hand. I unlocked the door, and the air that met us held the faintest harbor of lemon oil and old wood. Gabe moved the way considerate men in libraries move over the threshold under lintels along baseboards. He tapped the north wall of the dining room and wrote sound on his clipboard. "Newer plaster here," he said. "Done well." He crouched to run a finger along the seam where the kitchen tile met. The plank frowned slightly, then smiled. "No lie at the threshold," he murmured. "You'd be surprised how many rooms try to pretend they're joined when they're not." He tilted his head toward the ceiling. "Attic next." In the crawl space, his flashlight grazed joists like a slow, sure sunrise. "Good bones," he said into the dust. "A little caulking needed upstairs around the tub. Some insulation has slipped in the eaves. Nothing that argues with value." Harper followed him with her eyes, her hands loose, taking in without comment, and occasionally asking for a number she'd already half decided. We moved through rooms I knew by weather and sound, the bedroom that held heat until midnight, and gave it away around 2, the hallway, where a certain step always answered with a human sigh, the back porch whose screen never held tight in August. Harper's questions were a kind of kindness. When was the roof last redone? 11 years. Who installed the new furnace? Greeley and Sons. Which window sticks in October? The east off the living room, second from the corner. I could open it with a firm palm. She wrote. Gabe wrote, and the house seemed to clean its skirt just by being paid that sort of attention. Under the camellias, Gabe checked the gutter slope with an eye that had done this often. "A quarter bubble low at that corner," he said. "Easy correction." He looked from hedge to porch and back. "Someone loved plants here." "Daniel did," I said. "He believed in root balls and patience." Harper closed her notebook. "I may already have the right people," she said. "A couple just back from the desert. They're looking for a house with memory rather than perfection. They lost a son 2 years ago. They want soundness plus the feeling someone has stood in these rooms and mattered." The way she said it left no room for theatrics. "If we bring them," she added, "we do it quietly. No online pageantry. Your paper stands up on its own." We locked the door and stepped back as if from a thought arranged in the right words. Harper and Gabe left with a promise to send a written note of the inspection. I returned to Pine Street and set the keys down on the table. The kettle put its shoulder to a simmer. While it warmed, I opened my email. Marta's subject line read, "Supplemental instrument recorded." The scan when I clicked it showed Daniel's block letters again on a page I had not remembered. Memorandum of Understanding Co-Ownership Management. The clause was plain enough to withstand time unilateral authority to authorize sale or retention if co-ownership proved impracticable. 2 signatures is mine countersigned by a clerk whose stamp bled at the edges. I read it once, then again, then a third time, not to convince myself, but to let the memory of that day return. Daniel at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the sound of June practicing scales badly in the next room, his careful explanation that paper is a way of honoring love when memory gets busy and wanders off. I rested my fingers on the scanned line as if that would make the ink warmer. Marta's short note beneath the attachment offered no commentary beyond a date and the instruction print for your file. When the water boiled, I made tea and let the afternoon settle around the new page as if the house had grown another rib. I printed the document, trimmed the ragged edge the printer leaves, and laid it on top of the packet from Grant Street. The stack looked less like defense and more like a biography that could stand up under questioning. Harper's message arrived just after 2, pre-list inspection favorable. Her attachment contained Gabe's notes in tidy paragraph structure sound. Roof in good order, minor caulking recommended, gutters to be adjusted, no evidence of moisture intrusion. At the end, recommend private showing to selected buyers. Property presents as cared for and lived in. Harper's email body held 2 sentences. I have Caleb and Nora Dunn in mind. They're prepared and respectful. Noon tomorrow if you agree. I read the names to the empty room. They felt like a door that knew how to swing on its hinges. I answered yes. The confirmation came with minimalist precision, a time, a reminder to have copies of basic documents available, and a line about removing anything I didn't want touched. Not because these buyers would touch without asking, but because people often think better when an object is already where it belongs. Evening is a good time for dough. I brought the second pie out of the oven and let it breathe on the rack. I sorted a drawer that had tried all year to become a museum of elastic bands and extra batteries. In to keep mine went Daniel's screwdriver with the bent neck he called the persuader. In to leave no longer mine went a stack of cloth napkins Sloan had given me, good linen that never took to my table like cotton does. The decisions had the feel of honesty unadorned. The phone stirred again. Noah. Can we talk tonight? I stood looking at the words long enough to hear all the versions of his voice they might contain. I wrote back a single line. Tomorrow is better. The dots pulsed, stilled, pulsed again, stopped. I set the phone on the counter, covered the pie, and let the house return to its regular breathing. Harper arrived next day precisely at 11:57, with a clipboard in one hand and a small paper bag from the bakery in the other. For later, she said, placing it by the sink as if to prove she understood hunger and timing. At noon exactly, a sedan drew up quietly to the curb. A woman stepped out first, mid-50s, perhaps in a sweater that had known a washing machine without suffering. A man followed, taller, careful in motion, rather than fragile, as if he had learned how not to knock against door frames without looking at them. Nora and Caleb Dunn, Harper said. Eliza Hart. We shook hands the way strangers do when the air already holds a shared intention. I showed them the kitchen first because rooms like to be introduced at their center of gravity. Nora touched the pantry door and paused over the mismatched knobs. These are good, she murmured. My aunt used to collect them from yard sales and bring them home in paper lunch sacks. They came from 3 different houses, I said. Daniel liked the way the metal felt when it was worn by other people's years. Caleb drifted toward the window over the sink and stood looking into the small yard where shadows of lemon leaves lay on the fence like stencils. The light moves kindly, he said without looking away. We walked the room without advertisement. Nora asked where a chair used to be, her eyes finding a gap as if furniture leaves footprints. I told her about the corner in the living room where I used to read, where Daniel appeared each night with a crossword and fell asleep mid-clue with the pen uncapped between his fingers. She did not perform sympathy. She received the words and set them down gently as you would a cup you mean to wash and dry and return to the shelf in the right place. In the hallway, Caleb's fingertips grazed the wall at hip height, the way people touch for balance without needing it. In the back garden, he stopped under the camellias and tilted his face to the blossoms. My mother grew these, he said. She said their stubbornness was a virtue. He did not say anything about the son they had lost. I did not say anything about the daughter who now lived 2 states away. The air did not require it. Back at the kitchen table, Harper placed her clipboard neatly and looked not at the buyers, but at the papers I had arranged. I had set out copy's deed with the life right, Marta's letter, Gabe's inspection summary, 10 years of stamped tax receipts. Harper slid them toward the Dunns without a preface. Caleb read with the care of a person who does not rush what is meant to last. Nora traced one finger down the left margin as if following the staff in a piece of music. They looked up with the same unhurried gravity. We would like to make a full offer, Caleb said. Cash, no contingencies. Escrow as your broker recommends. The room did not change temperature. I breathed and found that there was room in it for air. Harper wrote the number that matched what we had discussed in private and placed the page between us, a bridge already built. I signed with a pen that didn't hesitate. Nora's smile was not triumph, just relief's sister. Caleb shook my hand again like someone setting a hand on a shoulder and meaning steadiness. They left as quietly as they came. Harper remained long enough to slide the signed pages into a folder and fasten the clip. I'll shepherd this, she said. Expect messages from me, not strangers. At the door she paused. You kept the right things in the right piles. When the house had returned to itself, the absence of shoes on the floorboards felt like an echo that knows when to stop. I put the bakery bag Harper had left on the counter and discovered 2 shortbreads the size of coins. I ate one and let the sugar insist on the existence of small mercies. The phone lit with a new message. Noah, what are you doing? Please stop. Then, almost on top of it, Sloan, this destabilizes everyone. It's confusing for Lila. The sentences arrived with the calm certainty of people who assume proximity is entitlement. I forwarded both to Marta with a subject line that carried no heat and wrote 3 words beneath them, proceed as discussed. Her reply came back, understood, with a copy to Harper in case anyone needed reminding where an answer should come from. The evening found a way to be ordinary. I boiled a small pot of pasta, shaved a hard cheese over it with the attention you give simple things when you have the tools for them. After I washed the pan and set it to dry, I opened the drawer where I keep the tidy receipts and pulled out one that had waited for its hour, Layton's Boutique Seam Repair No Charge. The date stood a day before the barbecue. The ink hadn't faded. Someone had written already, fraying in a hand that wasn't mine. I placed the slip in a clear sleeve and set it atop the stack to the right of Marta's letter. At 8:30, the doorbell rang, then the soft knock that belonged to a boy coming home after curfew. I opened the door before the second knock, and Noah stood there, smaller than his height tie, loosened a crease line marching across his cheek as if he had fallen asleep in a chair for 10 minutes and then woken in a hurry. Can I come in? He asked. Yes, I said the word wide enough to be truthful and not generous. He took Daniel's chair at the table without claiming it, hands clasped so tight his knuckles looked like poor porcelain. He tried a smile that had no bones in it. Mom, this doesn't have to happen like this. What is this? I asked. Say the noun. The sale, he said, and winced as if the word had sharp corners. It makes us all look. He stopped before he said bad and tried again. It's messy. People will talk. If we just give it time, everyone can calm down. Then we can figure something out. He glanced at the envelope and looked away. Sloan was upset. That's all. You know how she is. I do, I said. I know how you are too. He rubbed his thumb against his wedding band. Maybe the dress, maybe you didn't. Maybe it was the bench. Maybe. He ran out of maybes and let the sentence fall apart gently. His eyes went to the window the way Daniel's had whenever he wanted the night to absorb a silence. I opened the folder and laid the pages in a row the way a person might set out tools they mean to use only once. Deed. Marta's letter, tax receipts, inspection summary. At the end, face up and legible beyond dispute, the boutique slip from Layton's with its date and its arty fraying written in a cheerful shopgirl's script. Noah looked down the line as if following a story he had managed to avoid. He touched nothing. Where did you get that? He asked, and his voice made the question a little boy's just for a breath. From the place that replaced the seam, I said. The morning before the barbecue. He closed his eyes a second the way a person takes stock of a step they wish they could unwalk. When he opened them, the man had returned. It's complicated, he said, and the words fell between us and refused to be anything more than themselves. It isn't, though, I said, not with spite, not with the thrill of winning. You stood in a doorway and decided silence was a better story than the one that was true. That is not complicated. It is a choice. I tapped the deed, then the tax receipts. This is paper telling what it remembers. It doesn't ask anyone whether the story is comfortable. Everyone will think he began and stopped again because a sentence about everyone is an admission you have borrowed the wrong jury. You want people to think your mother is manageable, I said. I understand. Many people prefer their mothers like that. But I am not a rumor you can fix by waiting. A flush rose and softened. He pushed the chair back an inch, then stopped pushing. I never meant. The sentence refused to finish itself. He stood again. I should go, he said finally, sounding less like a decision than a weather report. He reached for the folder, not to take anything, just to pretend he might have the right to touch the pages. He let his hand fall and looked at me with a tightness I recognized from years ago. An infant jaw clenched against a fever, a boy jaw against a trumpet, embouchure, a teenager jaw against a lie he couldn't carry. Will you at least... He trailed off and tried again, smaller. Mom, please don't hate Sloan. I don't, I said. The truth of it surprised him. I could see the twitch that disbelief makes at the corner of a mouth. I don't hate people who are afraid. Afraid of what he asked because questions are a way to delay farewell. Of losing what a story gives them, I said. A place in a room, the center of a table. He nodded as if agreeing with something else entirely, then moved toward the door. At the threshold, he turned the way children do when they're not sure if the ritual requires it. I'll call you, he said. I'll answer, I said, which meant exactly what it said, and nothing more. The door clicked behind him, a gentle sound Daniel had always adjusted the hinge to make. When the kitchen was itself again, I gathered the papers with the clean motions of someone who has done this every day of a long life sort stack, square the corners. I slid the boutique slip into a sleeve behind the tax receipts, not because it mattered more, but because it belonged in the folder at that exact thickness. I returned the folder to the drawer where the good dish towels live, a place I open often enough to keep memory from settling into dust. The night had the unremarkable patience of a street that knows its own distances. I washed the 2 cups, dried them on the towel that has lost its ability to be fully white, and set them upside down on the rack. The house neither swelled nor shrank. It held. In the backyard, a neighbor's motion sensor light tripped went bright for a polite pause, then faded to a decent dark. In the morning, an email from Harper arrived like a well-made bed crisp, spare correct. Offer executed. Earnest money received. Escrow opened. She listed the escrow officer's name and the number of days they had proposed a brisk calendar that understood the difference between delay and due process. A second message from Marta landed a minute later, confirming receipt of the copied communications and the recorded instruments. I will respond on your behalf to any inquiries about process. There was no flourish, only the assurance baked into grammar when it does what it's supposed to. I printed both notes and placed them behind the inspection summary, then wrote the date on the note card I had started the day before. Offer executed, escrow open. The pencil made a persuasive quiet line. The day tilted towards ordinary chores. I took the throw rugs outside and shook them over the porch rail. I wiped the tops of door casings and found the same soft constellation of dust in all the places hands never touch. I wrapped the framed photograph of Daniel laughing with a face full of rain in 2 sheets of newsprint and set it in the keep box, then stood for a long minute with both hands on the lid as if listening to the inside of a seashell. When I sat down again, the phone hummed. Sloan, we heard you've involved third parties. This is unnecessary and cruel. It destabilizes Lila. We can't condone it. I read the words once and felt their scaffolding the pivot from personal slight to institutional tone, the appeal to an invisible child as a brace against argument, the scold disguised as grief. I forwarded the message to Marta and to Harper and then placed the phone face down so its small lighting up could not train my nerves. The mail came on time for the first time in a week. In it sat a thin envelope from the county assessor and 2 catalogs I hadn't asked to receive. I kept the first and walked the second to the recycling bin with a sense of running an errand for a neighbor. On the way back up the path, I paused to straighten a stone that had rolled sideways at the edge of the lemon tree bed. The act seemed disproportionately satisfying. When I returned to the kitchen, the note card on the table looked back at me like a sane person. Afternoon softened. I sat and took out a pen to address an envelope because that simple act, a person writing a name where a name belongs, has its own ballast. The name on the line was mine. The address was the Pine Street house where the kettle knows when to sing. I slipped the note card's duplicate inside that envelope and sealed it without licking, pressing the gum with the side of my thumb the way my mother used to. A copy for a file and a copy for a kitchen drawer, nothing more complex than that. Near 4, the stripe of light found the table again and laid itself down. Dust rose obediently and then surrendered to the stillness. I stood and smoothed the cloth with the flat of my hand as if the room might need reassuring that it was exactly itself. The keys to Linden lay on the counter, their weight unremarkable and perfectly adequate. I placed them in the wooden bowl by the door, where I keep the necessary small metal of daily life, and turned back to the sink. Out on the street, a child rode by, chanting numbers, pretending the cracks in the pavement were thresholds to vault. The voice rose and fell and then dissolved into other afternoon sounds. In the garden, a breeze touched the lemon leaves and let them go. I opened the cupboard. Chose a plain plate and set it in the center of the table without reason, simply because the room had balanced itself and liked a punctuation that did not pretend to be more than a period. The phone stayed dark. The pie cooled. The chair complained when I sat in it and then forgave me. I put both hands around a glass of water and held it long enough for the chill to declare itself. The house took one quiet breath and made room. Morning arrived the way good paper dries flat without drama. An email from Harper waited at the top of the stack, funds in escrow, all signatures verified. Title officer confirms timelines. Beneath it, a short line from Marta, I'll field outside inquiries. Route anything that smells like pressure. I printed both and tucked them behind Gabe's inspection notes, then stood a moment with my palms on the folder, the way a person steadies a box before carrying it down steps. At the bank, glass walls made the room feel like thought turned visible. Levi Park greeted me with the same careful voice he'd used over the phone. He didn't hustle me into a brochure. He opened a plain folder and laid out pages that had more function than shine. A living trust, he said, funded in stages with instructions that speak plainly. Distributions deferred until the age you choose. Successor trustee named. Power limited. He tapped a signature line with a capped pen. We'll design it so that no one signs except the person the document intends. We moved through clauses without hurry. He read each aloud as if words behave better when spoken. I adjusted a date here and age there the way you nudge a frame to square it. We named the trust with a title that would mean something to only 2 people, Camellia Street Trust. The beneficiaries list held one name, Lila Hart. When all the pages sat in order, I signed with a hand that didn't tremble. Levi notarized, then placed a brass key on the table. Safe deposit box, he said. Number stamped on the head. You decide when to hand it over. Outside, the sidewalk radiated a faint warmth from an autumn sun that knew how to be kind. I walked home with the folder under my arm, not pressed to my chest, the way people hold secrets but carried openly like a parcel the world should see and not break. Back in the kitchen, I set the trust papers beside. The deed, wrote the date on the note card, and slid it into the pocket of the folder that would go with me wherever I went next. The chair gave its usual complaint when I sat. The house exhaled. Near noon, a car door closed on Pine Street, and a quick knock landed on the frame with love's exact rhythm. 3, then a pause, then 1. Lila stood in a sweatshirt 2 sizes too big and held up a paper bag like evidence. Cranberry scones, she said. I stopped where the sign said, still warm, and believed them. She smelled like road wind and sugar. We ate at the table without ceremony, tearing the scones with our hands because the drawer where I keep the knives had decided to stick. When we finished, I slid the brass key toward her across the wood. This is yours one day, I said. You don't open it now. You keep it and forget it, and then you remember it exactly when remembering is useful. The box number is engraved. Your name is on the card at the branch. No other signatures count. Lila turned the key in her palm until the stamped numbers caught the light. Is this a big thing? She asked, careful not to step into a room she didn't know. It's a thing that knows your name, I said. It will wait for you. Her eyes shone in a way that didn't perform tears. She just looked straighter at me like a lens tightened. You didn't have to, she said. I wanted to, I answered. And you never made me smaller to do it. She reached for my hand. We sat a moment in a quiet that wasn't absence. In that small silence, her face jumped forward in time. I could see both the child who fell asleep in the back seat with a book open and the woman who would stand at a counter one day, signing something that protected her future. When she left, she tucked the key into the change pocket of her coat and patted it once like a promise. The inbox blinked with a different temperature when I returned to it. A forwarded email from Marta sat at the top, the thread beginning with Sloan, to whom it may concern. Paragraphs about domestic turbulence, elder confusion, and reputational harm, addressed to a supervisor at Noah's office, the sort of letter that wants to sound like a rescue while pushing someone over a rail. Marta's reply had already landed in the same thread, crisp as ironed linen. Cease any attempt to interfere with a lawful transaction. Future contact will be directed to counsel. She copied Harper and the title officer, then sent me a separate note. Handled. No response required. I closed the laptop and let the machine go dark. At the sink, I washed the 2 plates from the scones and stood them to dry. The lemon tree outside made a small shushing sound when the wind slid through it. I wrote Marta flowers on the corner of an envelope so I wouldn't forget a thank you that involved stems and paper rather than another email. The call from Harper came mid-afternoon. We've recorded, she said. Funds wired, receipt confirmed. The sentence contained no extra air. I said thank you and felt something in the center of my chest release the way a knot will when you find the right angle. After we hung up, I stood at the window and looked across the room as if the table had moved. It hadn't. It was my eyes that had. Keys have a weight that writes itself in your pocket. I took the Linden Avenue set from the bowl and laid them on the table, then put the Pine Street keys next to them just to look. 2 small constellations of cut metal catching afternoon light. One set that had unlocked a long sentence, another that would close it cleanly. I wrapped the Linden keys in brown paper and tied them with kitchen string because that is how you hand something over when you mean for it to be respected by the hands that receive it. That evening, I drove west. The road left town with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who knows where it's going. Fields shouldered up to the ditch lines, and a cut hay smell lay low in the car like a kind dog. In the past, the pines began to gather. Mist kept its distance and then came closer without deciding to be fog. When the bridge rose steel ribs against a pale sky. It looked less like spectacle and more like a sentence that knew how to make a clean clause. The cottage I had rented sat a few blocks from the harbor, a plain front cedar smell in the entry windows that understood how to frame salt light. I set my bag down and the room answered by becoming mine, just enough to welcome me. I opened 2 windows. The air came in without hesitation. I did not turn on a radio or the television. I would never remember how to work. I put the trust folder on the table and the brown-wrapped keys beside it and watched the edges of both settle. Later, I took out a sheet of paper and addressed a letter to Noah without the intention of stamps. I wrote what I could bear to say and what I could not hear replied. You have tried to live inside other people's comfort. I will not. I listed no grievances. I stacked no proofs. I told him the kitchen light at 410 makes a stripe that taught me to measure a day correctly, and that I hoped he would find a stripe of his own. A second letter I sealed. Lila, it began, and the sentences walked the straight path. What lives in the box where the papers lie, who to call at the branch? What to say to the clerk who will ask for identification? I added a single line she could carry in a pocket. No one can make your hands smaller than they are. I wrote my name carefully at the bottom and addressed the envelope in the square hand my mother taught me. Tomorrow I would mail it. Tonight it sat in plain view. When the house had dimmed to the color of a held breath, I opened a spiral notebook and wrote 3 lines each on its own stripe of paper so the page could take them whole. I am not a weight. I am not a contingency. I am not apologizing. The pen halted. The letter stood steady and plain. I closed the notebook and left it on the table like a tool I knew how to use. I unlatched the last window and let the evening come through. The sound of water against stone carried without needing to convince anyone. In the street, a gull made a brief complaint and then conceded the quiet to the hour. I lay down on the simple bed and listened until listening became sleep, the sort that doesn't bargain with morning. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.